Different words do different kinds of jobs in language structure. Look at this sentence. The tiny kitten ran through the garden. I could take kitten out of this sentence and replace it with another word. For example, puppy or rabbit or child, and the sentence would still sound fine. I could also replace kitten with words like chair or pumpkin or ocean. Now that would make the sentence sound weird because we know that chairs or pumpkins and oceans don't actually run, but the tiny chair or the tiny pumpkin or the tiny ocean would still make sense. It's not the grammatical structure of the tiny pumpkin ran through the garden that makes it sound weird. It's what we know about pumpkins. We could imagine a context where this sentence would be fine, like a game or a fairy tale where pumpkins had legs. What we can't do is replace the word kitten with words like sit or write or adopt. The tiny sit makes no sense because a word like sit just doesn't combine with words like the or tiny. The tiny write or the tiny adopt, also completely meaningless. We also can't replace the word kitten with past or across or in, or with blue or pretty or hairy, the tiny past, the tiny across, the tiny pretty. None of them make sense either. On the other hand, we could take the word through in ran through the garden and replace that with past or across or in. Ran past the garden, ran across the garden, ran in the garden. All those make sense. We could also take the word tiny in the tiny kitten and replace it with blue or pretty or hairy to get the blue kitten, the pretty kitten, or the hairy kitten. That's all fine. What this shows us is that not all words can go in the same place in a sentence. Different words combine with different kinds of other words. Parts of speech, or word classes, are groups of words that behave in the same way in a sentence. They can go in the same slot in the sentence. They can combine with the same kinds of other words. So kitten and puppy and rabbit and child belong to the same part of speech, not because of what they mean, but because they can all fill the same slot in a larger chunk of words, the tiny something. Similarly, the words through, past, across, and in all belong to different parts of speech, and tiny, blue, pretty, and hairy belong to a third part of speech. We know this because within each part of speech, we can replace one with the other in a phrase or a sentence and still get something that makes sense. Through the garden, past the garden, in the garden, and so on. But if we try to put in a word from a different part of speech, the tiny adopt, ran tiny the garden, the right kitten, the structure no longer makes sense. Identifying parts of speech. When we want to figure out what part of speech a word belongs to, there are three kinds of clues that we can use. Functional clues are the best known, but they're also the least reliable. Functional clues refer to what kind of meaning a word has. For example, that a verb is a doing word, it names an action, or that a noun names a person, place, or thing. We can't rely on functional clues alone because they're not always accurate. There are lots of nouns that don't name persons, places, or things. For example, freedom, or literacy, or anti-disestablishmentarianism. And there's lots of words that name actions but aren't actually verbs, like destruction, which could be thought of as describing an action, but it is a noun, not a verb. And for some parts of speech, it's quite hard to give a description of their meaning. For example, what kind of a meaning would you say that the word on has, or it? The second type of clue is morphological clues. And this refers to the bits that can be added onto a word to change it in various ways. You've probably heard the word morph, which in everyday speech means something like to change into something else. In linguistics, morphology refers to the various ways in which words can be changed by adding bits to them. For example, most nouns in English can have the plural suffix s attached to them in order to talk about there being more than one of the thing that the noun refers to. So for example, from dog, we can get dogs, more than one dog. From cat, we can get cats. From tree, we can get trees, and so on. This is a morphological clue. If a word can have a plural s added onto it, then it is a noun. But not all nouns take a plural s. For example, the plural of sheep is sheep, not sheeps. And the plural of child is children and not childs. So morphological clues can't be relied on their own either, because there are nearly always exceptions. So the best way of determining the part of speech of a word is by using syntactic clues, which is what we used just now when we explained how we know that there are different parts of speech. Syntactic clues refer to what kind of a job a word is doing in a sentence and which other words it can combine with. The fact that the word kitten can combine with the words the and tiny to make up the tiny kitten is evidence that kitten is a noun, because words that combine with determiners like the and adjectives like tiny are nouns in English. We tried putting other kinds of words into the same slot, for example, a verb, the tiny adopt, or a preposition, the tiny in, and we saw that that didn't work. So looking at the different kinds of words that a word can combine with and what kind of a job the word is doing in the sentence as a whole is a reliable way to figure out its part of speech. Phrases. The important thing about the syntactic clues is that they refer to how individual words combine into bigger chunks. There are different kinds of these chunks, like phrases, clauses, and sentences, and we'll talk much more about them later on. But before we start going through the syntactic clues that define each part of speech, it's important to have an understanding of a particular type of chunk called a phrase. A phrase is a chunk of words that fills a single slot in a clause or a sentence, or sometimes in another phrase. Look at the clause, he loves coffee. There are two parts to this clause. There's someone that we're being given some information about, that's he, and then there's the information that we're being given about him, loves coffee. He is just a single word, but in the same place where he goes in this clause, I could put a whole string of words. For example, that tall guy with a beard who works with my sister's boyfriend loves coffee. Now, who loves coffee? That tall guy with the beard who works with my sister's boyfriend does. So in this clause, the thing that we're being given information about is that tall guy with the beard who works with my sister's boyfriend. So this whole chunk of words is now doing the same job in the clause as he was doing in the first example. These 12 words, that tall guy with the beard who works with my sister's boyfriend, work as a unit. They all refer to a single person, and if we were going to move it to another place in the clause, we would have to move the whole chunk together. For example, if we change the sentence to the one who loves coffee is that tall guy with the beard who works with my sister's boyfriend, those 12 words still have to stay together. We couldn't break them up and say, for example, the one who that tall guy loves coffee is with the beard who works with my sister's boyfriend. So a chunk of words like this that goes in a single slot in the clause, refers to a single entity, can't be broken apart, is called a phrase. This particular phrase is a noun phrase because the most important word in it, guy, is a noun. But there are many other types of phrases. We'll look at phrases in more detail later in the course. Multifunctionality of English words. Unfortunately, even the syntactic clues to identifying parts of speech can sometimes be confusing. because it's very common for English words to be able to do more than one kind of job in a sentence. If I say, I was walking my dog, then walk is a verb. I know this because it takes the suffix ing, which applies to verbs but not to nouns. You can't say kittening. Another reason I know it's a verb is that it combines with the auxiliary verb was, which again is something that only verbs do. You can't say was kitten. You can say was a kitten, but then was isn't functioning as an auxiliary but as a main verb. We'll learn more about this later on. In terms of the syntax, walk here combines with what we call a subject, someone doing the walking, and in this case also an object, something or someone having the walking done to them. That's the dog in this sentence. And all of these are characteristics of verbs. But if I say, I took a long walk, then walk is a noun because it combines with words like a and long. And we could put a plural s on it if we wanted to. We could say, I went for lots of long walks during the holidays. And it's also the object of the verb took. It's the thing that I took. And all of these are characteristics of nouns. So many words can have different parts of speech depending on the context they're used in. And that's why it's important to look at how the word is being used in a sentence when we're trying to decide which part of speech it is. If it's doing the job of a noun, then it is a noun, even if in some other contexts it may also be a verb.